Does the Catholic Church oppose science? Some people think it does. And one of the key ways in which some people think the Church opposes science is by the text of Genesis, the text of Genesis from the Bible. So people say, you know, the text of Genesis, the story of creation, and science of evolution, these are irreconcilably opposed. What I'd like to talk to you about today is how to understand Genesis and to address the question, is Genesis and evolution necessarily opposed? Now, in order to understand anything, we need to understand the thing in its context. So think about a word. If I say the word gift to you, G-I-F-T, and I'm speaking to you in English, you think of a present, maybe a birthday present, a Christmas present, and that's correct. But the very same word, spelled the very same way in German, means poison. So how do you know whether I'm talking about gift as a present or gift as poison? Well, you take into account the context, right? Right now I'm speaking English, and so since the rest of this talk is in English, you'd say, well, if he says gift, he must mean a present. Now, if I were in Germany and I was speaking German, well, then that word gift could have a different meaning of poison. So the same thing is true about a whole sentence. So let's say I say to you, we're out at a party and you spill your drink on me and we're good friends and I laugh and I say, I'm going to kill you. Well, you wouldn't be scared, right? You wouldn't think I'm actually about to murder you. But let's take a different context. Let's say you're walking back to your car and it's midnight and all of a sudden I come out from behind the bushes and I've got a knife and I'm wearing a leather jacket and I put the knife right to your throat and said, I'm going to kill you. Well, you would be terrified, right? You'd think it was a real threat. So the words, I'm going to kill you, mean one thing if we're laughing and joking and we're friends and it's at a party, and mean something totally different if I've never met you and I'm carrying a weapon and it's midnight. So in order to understand what Genesis is about, it's vitally important that we understand the context of Genesis. And one thing is for certain, Genesis is not about contemporary science. Just as it's certain that Genesis is not about say, contemporary cell phones. If I were to read Genesis and try to figure out, should I buy a new iPhone or not, that would be really crazy. Why? Well, because obviously the original writer of Genesis and the original readers of Genesis weren't thinking about iPhones, right? iPhones did not exist thousands of years ago. So it couldn't have been on their mind being for or against iPhones. Now, in a similar way, the original writers and readers of Genesis knew nothing whatsoever about the contemporary theory of evolution. They weren't for evolution, they weren't against evolution. So if I'm reading the text of Genesis as if it's for evolution or against evolution, I'm misreading the text. That can't be what it's about. So what is the text of Genesis about? Well, I think that the text of Genesis is a story written as a rival account of creation, rival to the other stories circulating in the ancient world. So what are those stories? Well, in the ancient world, there were many rival stories of creation. The Babylonians had them, the Egyptians had them, the Greeks had them. And one of the commonalities of these stories is that creation was thought of as the result of a cosmic battle. There's a multiplicity of deities, and these deities got into a huge fight, and as a result of their battle, the earth arose. Now, Genesis is written as a rival to these stories. It's meant to correct these stories. And so what does Genesis say? Well, let's take a look at the text. If we look at the very beginning of Genesis, we see it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And you might say, well, I've read this a million times. Yeah, it says in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. What's so new about that? Well, if we read it in its original context, those words are actually quite revolutionary. Because we find in the beginning only one God, not many gods, and we find in the beginning that God creates without violence, without a battle. And this is quite significant, because if you think of creation as a result of a cosmic battle, as a result of gods fighting each other, well, then what you'd expect to find is creation is a disorderly, chaotic mess. And that is the view that many people in the ancient world had. And Genesis is promoting a different view, that actually creation is not chaotic and disorderly and just a mess of stuff, but rather that creation is orderly. And Genesis emphasizes this theme again and again, that creation is orderly and that creation is good. So famously, of course, in the text, God says, "Let there be light." And then there was light. Now, what does this mean? Well, we see God creating through speech. And speech of its very nature is orderly, right? Right now I'm speaking to you, and the reason you can understand me is that I'm using the words in an orderly way. I've got the subject, and then I've got the predicate. If I just were to blurt out a bunch of words in a random order, you wouldn't understand a single word I'm saying. So a sentence makes sense because there's an order to it. So God creates not through violence, not through overcoming rival gods in a big fight, but rather God creates through orderly speech, through reasonable speech. And so the text of Genesis is giving us the message that creation itself is orderly and reasonable. It reflects a divine mind. Because after all, speech reflects a mind. If I'm saying a bunch of words to you and they make sense, well, that reflects something of my mind, something that's in my mind first, then comes out of my mind in terms of speech. Now, this idea that creation is orderly, this idea that creation is understandable, intelligible, is what centuries later gives rise to the idea of science. Science gets started because people thought the world is reasonable, the world is understandable, I can make sense of the world. And if you have that supposition, it makes sense to start doing experiments. If you have the opposite supposition, that the world is chaotic and random and violent and just a mess of stuff, well, it wouldn't really make sense to do experiments. Why? Well, because you do experiment one day and it would result in something, and then the very next day it would result in something different, and later that afternoon something else again. It just would be random, chaotic, disorderly stuff happening all the time. So Genesis is not science, and we misread Genesis if we think it is science. Just like we'd misread Shakespeare if we thought Shakespeare was a weather report. One of Shakespeare's most beautiful sonnets is Sonnet 18, and he says, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short of date." So you can imagine a very simplistic reader saying, so rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. I'm going to check the weather report. And oh, no, Shakespeare, you're wrong. Last May there was no rough winds. Well, somebody who read Shakespeare as a weather report would be radically misunderstanding it. So Genesis is not science, but Genesis does put forward beliefs that give rise to science. And it does this in another way. So in Genesis, it says that God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars. And this too is important, because in the ancient world, many people thought that the sun and the moon and the stars and the earth and the sea and so on were all divine. And if these things are divine, well, then the proper response would be to worship these things. And if we worship these things, we're not going to do science, because science is about what? It's about taking things apart, dissecting things, experimenting on things. And so if you really thought that the things of nature were divine, well, as human beings, we'd worship those things rather than do science. So Genesis is not science, but Genesis does open the door to science and make science possible through this belief that creation is intelligible, and secondly, the belief that creation is not divine, but rather a creature, and can therefore be understood. Genesis is teaching us therefore very important lessons. And one of the most important lessons of Genesis is about the goodness of creation. Many times the text said God created this and it was good. God created that and it was good. And this lesson too is something that was correcting the other stories of ancient days. In those stories, creation, the physical creation was seen as evil as a result of an evil God. And what Genesis is suggesting to us is that no, creation is good. It reflects the rationality of God, and it reflects also the goodness of God. So creation is not divine. We would make a mistake if we worship Mother Earth as if it were a goddess. It's not divine, it's a creature. But nevertheless, it is certainly good. So Genesis talks about the goodness of creation, but it also talks about the goodness of us, that is, human beings. It says famously that we are created in God's image. And again, when we hear those words, okay, human beings created in God's image, you might say, I have heard this 100 times. Yeah. But the significance of this is seen through looking at the rival stories in ancient times. And basically in those stories, it said that some people were created in God's image. The king was, and maybe the king's son. But pretty much everybody else, if you're not in the royal family, you are not created in God's image. If you're a peasant, a commoner, just a regular person, you aren't in God's image. Now this idea that all human beings are created in God's image is incredibly important and influential later. In fact, our idea of human rights arises from this idea of every human being made in God's image. The whole idea of human rights is that all of us, male, female, young, old, whatever our race, whatever our religion, whatever our class, whatever our culture, all of us deserve respect. All of us deserve legal protection. All of us should be loved and cherished. And again, this idea is quite revolutionary. In the ancient world, again, in these stories, only the royal family was made in God's image. And Genesis is proposing a very different view, that all of us are part of God's royal family.
You have heard the traditional Veni Creator Spiritus, Come Creator Spirit song. We do not know the author of this song. It is an invocation to the Holy Spirit, and it is sung in the Catholic Church during the liturgical celebrations of the Feast of the Pentecost. It is also sung during the ordinations of priests and bishops and at some solemn events. It is such a heavenly feeling and experience when we listen to it being sung in Gregorian chant. Father Mike Manning has written a booklet to understand this great song of praise. He takes the English translation of the song and explains it in detail, but in plain language. It will surely help you understand and pray with this song in praise of the Holy Spirit. We want you to have a copy of this booklet.
Call the number on the screen or email us. You can also order it through our website. Come, Holy Spirit, enlighten our minds and hearts.
And part of Genesis, of course, maybe the most famous part, is the story of Adam and Eve, right? What's going on with the story of Adam and Eve? Well, let's take a look at the text again. If we look at the story of Adam and Eve, there's a lot of very interesting parts to it. I want to focus in particular where it says, the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. This idea that human beings are made of two things, the dust of the ground and the breath of life. This is quite important also. It's important because if we're made up of two elements, we're made up of the matter, the dust, we're made up of the spiritual, the breath of life. And Genesis, again, is putting forward a very important message here, because some philosophies of life, you might want to say, reduce human beings to nothing but spirit. We're as if we were angels. And so that can really distort a proper understanding of the human person. This stuff here, my flesh and blood, is really part of me, and your flesh and blood are really part of you. On the other hand, there's another error, and that would be to say all we are is matter. All we are is the dust of the earth. There's no spiritual element to us whatsoever. And Genesis wants to avoid both of these and say, no, the proper understanding of who we are as human beings is this combination. We are matter and spirit. We are body and soul. And thinking of us as just one or the other is to distort who we are. We're a little bit like, say, water. Right? Water is H2O. It's two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom. And you need both, right? Just oxygen is not water, just hydrogen is not water. To have water, you need H2O, both together. And so as human beings, we're similar, right? Our body alone without the soul is not us. That's just a corpse. The soul alone without us isn't really us. We are this unity of body and soul together. And this is a very, very important lesson. Another important lesson from Genesis has to do with the relationship between men and women, right? Very famously, the text of Genesis says that Eve is created from the rib of Adam. And what does that mean? Well, one thing it means is this, that men and women share in human nature. Men and women alike share equally in human nature. And Thomas Aquinas famously wrote about this passage, that Eve was not created from the head of Adam to be his ruler and guardian. Eve was not made from the foot of Adam to be his slave and his servant. Eve was made from the side of Adam to be his partner and companion. So for Aquinas, the idea of being made from the rib is a way of symbolically talking about the fact that Adam and Eve, the fact that man and woman have an equal human dignity, and neither one should be, as it were, lording it over the other one. Now, of course, you know, I'm sure, that the story of Adam and Eve doesn't stop with the creation of Eve. It continues, and it turns a little bit dark. But before it turns dark, we should note that Adam, when he first meets Eve, says, "At last, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." And this, too, is a really important lesson, because Adam obviously is appreciating the beauty of Eve. He notices how different she is from all the other animals that are made. And so the text is saying that the attraction and love between man and a woman is a beautiful and a good thing. And again, this too is a correction of the stories circulating in the ancient world that saw this attraction as something from the dark gods, from the bad gods, something that was evil and wrong. So the love between Adam and Eve starts off good. It's part of the good of creation. But as we know, the story continues and things head a little south. God gives them this command that you can eat of any tree you want to in the garden, except for one, right? He said, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That fruit you shouldn't eat. Every other fruit is fair game. Now, what does this mean, right? What is this fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Well, if I were to say to you, I know philosophy from the pre-Socratic philosophers all the way to Alasdair MacIntyre, a contemporary philosopher. Or if I say to you, I know philosophy from A to Z, well, those would all be ways of saying I know philosophy completely. Just like if I say I know the United States from East Coast to West Coast, it's another way of saying I know it completely. So to speak of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil is to say, if we get this, we have knowledge all the way from one extreme of good all the way to the other extreme of evil. In other words, I have perfect knowledge. But who has perfect knowledge? Well, really only God has perfect knowledge. And so to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a way of talking about the human desire to become God, to take over, to be in ultimate charge. And even the atheistic philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre once said that man is the desire to be God. That is to say, even as an atheist, he recognized that everybody has this desire to be in total control and total charge. And you might say, well, why did God give this command? Is he trying to ruin our fun? Is he trying to get in the way? Well, no, not at all. I mean, imagine somebody who tried to become a dog, right? They got down on all fours and they ate dog food and they, went around and barked at dogs and hung out at dog parks. Well, no matter how hard a person tried to become a dog, a person really can't become a dog. What would happen to someone who tried to become a dog is that they would lose all the goods of their humanity, right? They couldn't have human friendships. They couldn't enjoy human knowledge and read books and go to movies. They couldn't have a human family. They would lose all the good things that come along with being a human and accepting the reality that you're a human. Well, just as we can never really become a dog, and all we would do is ruin our human goods if we try to become a dog, the same thing is true about trying to become God. We can't become God, right? It's impossible. In fact, it's even more impossible to become God than it would be to try to become a dog. At least a dog is, a creature and is an animal, so it's sort of more like us. But to become God is even more out of our reach. So what happens if we try to become God? Well, what happens is we lose the goods of our distinctly human life, right? We lose human friendship. Because if I really think I'm a God, well, how am I going to treat other people? I'm going to look down on them, right? They're second class. I'm divine and you're merely human, right? If I really thought I was God, when I deserve to have all the power, I should really run the world. And isn't it true that some of the worst people that ever walked planet Earth were people who more or less explicitly wanted absolute power? They wanted to be completely in charge, right? Think of Stalin, think of Hitler, think of Mao, and we've got a long list of people who wanted absolute power as if they were God, as if they were divine. The trouble, of course, is if you don't have divine wisdom and you don't have divine love and you don't have divine goodness, having absolute power is going to be a huge problem. It's going to be a huge problem for everyone around you, and it's going to be a huge problem for you. So the story of Genesis is warning us. It's saying don't try to become God. Don't try to define good and evil as if you were in charge of the whole universe. It's saying to us, accept your humanity, accept your created reality, and that is the way to move forward. That is the way to happiness. Now, as we know from the story, Adam and Eve didn't do that. They didn't accept their humanity. They did eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so what happens? Well, what happens is immediately they realize that they're naked. So before the fall, Adam and Eve were almost like little children. 2-year-olds, 1-year-olds, they don't worry about being naked. They are totally at ease with each other. But as we grow older, we grow less at ease with ourselves and less at ease with others. And Adam and Eve felt like they had to protect themselves from each other. They couldn't be totally open and totally vulnerable with each other. So they put on clothes. So what is this part about when God is asking for Adam, where are you? Well, I think what he's talking about is he's trying to get Adam to be honest. God is acting a little bit like a mother might act if she tells her child, don't get into the cookies, right? And then she comes across her kid and the kid has cookie crumbs all over the kid's face. Well, clearly in a case like that, the mom knows the kid has been in the cookies. And so when the kid asks, or when the mom asks, did you get into the cookies? She's not really asking about information. She knows. But she wants the child to be honest. She wants the child to acknowledge the reality and to come clean, and so that their relationship can be restored. So God's doing the same thing with Adam. And what does Adam do? Well, he does what many of us do, right? Rather than be honest and come clean, he obfuscates. He blames someone else, right? He says, well, God, the woman you gave me, she gave me the fruit to eat, and so I ate it. So in other words, what Adam does is not take responsibility. He doesn't say, wow, God, I'm really sorry. I shouldn't have done that. That's a terrible idea. Rather, what he does is he blames his wife, and then he blames God. And this text is so contemporary. I mean, think about how many people today, politicians or whoever, caught doing something bad, and immediately they start blaming other people, right? It's not my fault. It's someone else, this person's fault, that person's fault, right? They don't take responsibility. And what about Eve, right? God asks her, well, what happened? And she says, well, the serpent tempted me and I ate. So she's invited to take responsibility. And does she? Nope, she passes the buck also, right? The serpent who you created, God, he gave me to eat. So both Adam and Eve are, you might say, primordial humans in their desire to be God, to overthrow the proper order of creation, and in their reluctance to accept responsibility. So Eve doesn't take responsibility. Now what happens then? Well, the text talks about God punishing Adam and Eve. And it's important to understand what God's punishments are. God never punishes people as a vindictive act, as if God is filled with hatred. God is a being of pure love. God is always loving. That's just what he does. But it is true that sometimes people can experience God in this negative sort of way. And that's exactly what happened to Adam and Eve. So they experience the alienation from each other, right? They're no longer at ease with each other. They experience an alienation with God. and they even experience an alienation within themselves. So the text of Genesis is best read not as a textbook of science. Again, some people read Genesis as in a very simplistic way, and they think, oh, this must be, all about contemporary science. It's not about that. It's teaching us very important truths. One way in which some people misread it, I think, is they look at the 7 days of creation, the 6 days of creation, the day of rest, and then they say, aha, so the day means, day is 24 hours, and we know from science that clearly everything did not arise in 6 24-hour periods, so Genesis is just a bunch of nonsense. Well, I think that interpretation of Genesis is a bunch of nonsense. When Genesis talks about a day, it's speaking not necessarily about a single 24-hour period. It's a little bit like if I say to you, well, back in my day, when I was in high school, we didn't have cell phones. Now, no intelligent person would say, oh, so Professor Kaczor must have gone through all high school in 24 hours, because he says back in his day, when he was in high school, he was, well, no, of course not, right? Everyone understands, who understands English, the day in English can be used either to mean a 24-hour period or just back in the day, in the old days or whatever. So the same thing is true of day in Scripture. So Genesis is an extremely important text, teaching us extremely important lessons for today, but we would misread it if we read it as a scientific treatise. And so, is the church opposed to science because the church proclaims the text of Genesis as part of God's Word? Not in the least. Thank you.
You have heard the traditional Veni Creator Spiritus, Come Creator Spirit song. We do not know the author of this song. It is an invocation to the Holy Spirit, and it is sung in the Catholic Church during the liturgical celebrations of the Feast of the Pentecost. It is also sung during the ordinations of priests and bishops and at some solemn events. It is such a heavenly feeling and experience when we listen to it being sung in Gregorian chant. Father Mike Manning has written a booklet to understand this great song of praise. He takes the English translation of the song and explains it in detail, but in plain language. It will surely help you understand and pray with this song in praise of the Holy Spirit. We want you to have a copy of this booklet.
Call the number on the screen or email us. You can also order it through our website. Come, Holy Spirit, enlighten our minds and hearts.